Thanks for having me. Lovely to see the giveaways. It sort of feels like I'm coming to a fairground of some sort, and you all got the lucky dip. I hope you think that after you've read it. We'll have to see, right? But look, it's great to be here, and I'm also very happy to see that you were giving away my two most recent books, and the title of my speech is, in fact, the third book. So this is all just one big book sale effort, folks. But I will say that it was the Bristlecone and ILP people who chose the title. So, you know, you're out there doing this. So I'm very happy to see it. I'm actually also, the other reason why I think this is good, though, is because, you know, it's a bold title for a reason. And I'm going to guess that my presentation will be somewhat different from that which you've seen until now, because I'm grappling with what I think is something far bigger, not to say better or anything else, but certainly bigger in terms of what we care about than just technology. Blockchain is not just a new widget, a new app, or a database. It's actually a social technology. It's a mechanism by which society can deal with how it arrives at truth. Because truth is always been a subjective, collective exercise. There really is no objective truth. I hate to sort of break that to you, but there's varying degrees to which we can arrive at an objective truth. But I don't know how many of you know the work of Yuval Harari on his fabulous book, Sapiens. This is this process by which we come to arrive at the truth, this consensus gathering exercise, is the means by which we form collective organization. And I'm going to get to a little bit later on why that matters for supply chains. But ultimately, it's a complicated technology because it requires human beings to come together to optimize it. So, you know, it is a bold statement for that reason. But to get to Harari's point, he's arguing, well, how is it that we ended up ruling the planet, not the bonobos, right? Because these are smart animals. And in fact, our DNA is pretty close, we all know, right? There's this very minimal amount of genetic material that differentiates us. So what was the killer app, if you like, that allowed human beings to form something as phenomenal as New York City? It is this capacity to come to agreement around a set of facts. And he talks about this idea of storytelling, is the fact that we can agree on a story, we can believe in something collectively. And ultimately, that concept requires us to do a bunch of information processing. So what we've managed to do is to figure out how to both gather information so that we can sort of feel comfortable around those facts, and then, you know, work out mechanisms for those agreements. And a lot of that is done through institutions and various other forms of social norms and cultural behaviors and so forth. But there's a lot of social infrastructure that goes into it. Now, a key part, as I said, was information. And what we've done through the process of going from, you know, when we first formed social organizations, an act of just basically talking from one-on-one to each other, to then maybe getting a horse to be able to expand the speed with which we could communicate, to then bringing in vehicles of different sorts, and eventually cars and airplanes, and then ultimately the internet. And with the internet, we're now able to, you know, almost instantaneously and at virtually zero cost, communicate with anybody anywhere. And this is a profoundly powerful thing for this purpose of arriving at this common set of facts and organizing ourselves to do things together. So it's to the point where, you know, this is, I think this is somewhere in Belize, we can now basically connect with anybody anywhere. And that is, you know, raised exponentially human beings' capacity to organize, gather together, and embark on common enterprises, like building a city or forming a supply chain. So this is a key component of it. But there's this one other fundamental concern that we've also, through history, had to grapple with, and it's trust. So unless we, you know, could trust each other, we weren't able to leave the trees and form tribes. And then through this process of gathering and formulating trust amongst each other so that we could know that the other guy would have my back as I was out there tracking down the woolly mammoth, I needed to have this sense of trust. I needed to trust what they were telling me and whether I could trust them, right? So, you know, what we've also done is created also technologies for how we deal with trust. And mostly it's formulated around institutions. So government is the classic part of this. We formed a government to basically set the rules around which we would all have to interact with each other, and we would basically defer to that regulatory structure a set of understandings on how we get along with each other. Some of it's also cultural. Language is a means by which we have a set of rules around which we communicate, and with that we form trust as well. But in the economic and financial realm, once we started dealing with money, and money, by the way, to Harari's point, is one of the great myths, the great stories that we've told, right? Because money is really just a collective agreement in something that doesn't have any inherent value. I hate to tell this to you folks, but it really doesn't. It is nothing more than a symbolic marker through which we remember and recall how much everybody owes each other. It's a means by which we clear our debts with each other. So it's just a communication device. And we're only able to actually get around to making it work because we told each other this crazy lie that it actually had inherent value. And it's brilliant, right? This is what he gets at. This is this conversational collective agreement things. But money is so difficult because it holds so much value. Once it got to this point, then we really had a whole other set of trust mechanisms that we needed in place to manage our money. And one of the biggest inventions beyond money itself came from this guy. This is Giovanni de' Medici, one of the most important bankers in history, who realized that if we took double entry bookkeeping, he could take the sort of mundane exercise of just lending his capital to other people and debit his clients on one place and credit them on the other. He would effectively create money. So we went from this problem that we had where the only way we could exchange money with each other and therefore exchange value and embark on economic activity was on a face-to-face basis to one that could now be anywhere. So merchants in Venice could now enter into transactions with importers in London because the Medici was sitting in the middle of this particular transaction, debiting one and crediting the other. Now, there's a fundamental problem with this, though. First of all, just to be clear, I think we spent a lot of time bashing banks. I certainly have written a lot that's, critical of the way that our financial system works. But let's just reflect momentarily on how much of a profound invention this was. So we got the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the modern world, everything that we have in some respects, built upon this idea that we would take banking and finance to facilitate this massive exercise of collective activity. But there's a core problem with this, and I think there's two words I like to use that ultimately emphasizes it. You can put them in either order, but you get the message. It's not just a joke, it truly is the case. That crisis was a problem of centralized record keeping. This is the core issue when we're talking about how we can arrive at this consensus of facts and agree upon something to work. We need somebody to have a set of records that we can all trust. And we had to trust the bankers to do it for us. We built this really complex Rube Goldberg-like machine of all these different centralized ledgers, each having to communicate with each other, which required reconciliation and really sort of difficult transparency around that. Because each secretive party is hanging on to their information and not willing to share it with the other, certainly not on a real-time basis. And so we resolve it through auditing and government regulation and certain sort of rights and rules that regulators have and different clearing houses and everything else, but ultimately it just creates this complex mass to the point that in 2008, and it really wasn't, to be honest, Lehman Brothers' fault, they just became the sort of the catchphrase for it. We didn't have a clue what the facts were. The CDS, the credit default swaps we didn't know what the counterparty risk looked like, right? This is a story that we're all familiar with. And that's a problem of centralized ledgers, the fact that it's a secretive thing where there is one institution that is in charge of this. We are trusting these institutions to manage our information so that the rest of us can go about our economic activity. So the internet came along, and in the 90s, a bunch of guys said, wow, this is great. We've got this decentralized architecture for sharing information, and all money is information. So I'm glad you're taking a photo because that's my mum over there, but she's become moderately famous as a result. I've used this slide a few times. And ultimately, it was clear, well, if money's just information, surely we can use the internet to basically much more rapidly and easily on a peer-to-peer basis share information. There's a problem though, and that is, money is a ledger. It's a big record-keeping device. And therefore, for it to work, we have to know that it hasn't been counterfeited. That the dollar that I have spent sending money to my mum in Perth, Australia, if you didn't guess my accent, I'm not just going ahead and sending it to somebody in Rome, right? It's called the double spend problem. And this was the fundamental challenge that the inventors of cryptocurrency grappled with for 20 years. It was a big deal. How do we do this? And I'll get to now as to why this was difficult, because the thinking was, if you're going to have this ledger, everyone who understood money realized that you had to have a ledger, you had to have a record-keeping device. The banks had done that in the past, but if we were going to create an internet version of this, that is a truly decentralized system where we all keep track of it all, rather than one centralized institution, we have to have something like a consensus mechanism built into it. We need a means by which we can all agree what the facts are. Every time there's a dollar spent, can we all agree on what that updated thing was? And we couldn't figure this out. And one of the reasons why we couldn't do this is because there's this famous New Yorker joke that some of you would be familiar from back in 1993, I think it was. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, right? You can just be anybody. So we could have this decentralized structure, but if I essentially replicated myself, so there's now Michael Casey 1, Michael Casey 2, Michael Casey 3, Michael Casey 4, and no way for anybody to realize that that's who I am because I'm a dog for all they know, then I can just overtake the consensus mechanism, because ultimately we're talking about 50% of the votes, right? So how are we going to do this? And it was a struggle for 20 years, these cryptographers trying to figure this thing out. And then along came Satoshi Nakamoto, who is either a male, female, or a group of people, we don't know, pseudonymous, probably all heard the name by now, pseudonymous inventor of Bitcoin. And he, or she, or they, realized that there was a really inventive way to resolve this problem. And what it was you were going to put a cost on every single vote that happened in the system. So people have been talking for some time about how if you were going to sort of disincentivize spam email, for example, you should charge somebody 1 cent every time they send an email. So a trivial amount of money for sending one email, an annoyingly expensive thing if you want to spam everybody, right? But the problem is we couldn't put 1 cent into the internet because we didn't know how to do money on the internet, and we certainly still don't really know how to do money on the internet, if you've heard about Equifax and things like that. The solution that the guy called Adam Back, before Bitcoin, came up with for spam was a thing called Hashcash. And Hashcash created a cryptographic puzzle that your computer had to resolve, which is effectively just a search for a number, right? There's an infinite number of numbers in the world, and so if you want to really sort of bog your computer down a little bit, you make it really hard to find a particular number. So you can algorithmically create this task, and you can tweak it up or down, make it really hard or relatively easy, whatever. And if you impose that cost, then it's going to cost you your computational resources, which are the device itself, the hardware, the use of that hardware, but also, of course, electricity. So the cost of electricity and the cost of the hardware and everything else that goes into that is going to make it more expensive for me to create multiple Michael Caseys, right? This became the mechanism by which you prevented this, what they call 51% attack, that somebody could take over the entire network. It becomes increasingly expensive to do so. The algorithm in Bitcoin has this adjusting mechanism so that the more hashing power, hashing is this cryptographic exercise that you go through, the more hashing power that's on the network, the harder that puzzle becomes. It's called the difficulty adjustment, and it gets increasingly difficult. So you're constantly sort of racing against this computational challenge, and for 9 years it has kept this thing safe. Bitcoin is worth $100 billion. Which is a massive bounty, right? You'd think anybody would want to take that thing down and sort of figure out how to exploit it and shift money around on your behalf. And they can't, because it's just prodigiously expensive to take it over. You're going to need to basically spend billions and billions of dollars to create the level of hashing power that's needed to take over 51% for just one transaction. And if you go back in history and want to change something from, say, 3 blocks ago, blocks are these 10-minute phases within what's called the blockchain, the underlying technology, then it's going to cost you enormously. So it's worked all this time. So it's impossible to double spend in this decentralized way. This was a profound idea. And one of the things that's really compelling about it is, it is a mechanism for collectively working on something without anybody being in charge. They call it censorship resistance. There's no single entity, unlike the Medici or Lehman Brothers, looking after the records who can change it. And so that means that that record becomes, the word we like to use is immutable. I think it's a little bit of a stretch because nothing is truly immutable. But nonetheless, it's the closest thing we've ever had to an immutable record because no one can change it unless you are willing to spend an insane amount of money to do it. And maybe you will, but that often, it's hard to, the math just doesn't add up all the time. Now, underlying this is this blockchain ledger. So this thing that everybody is updating on, all these computers are basically, rather than being Lehman Brothers looking after the ledger, we're all collectively doing so, is a distributed ledger. It doesn't reside in one single place like this old model of the clearinghouse, but it resides on every single actor's, at least a lot of actors' computers. And effectively, there's a mechanism by which every time a new transaction is added to the blockchain, there's a process of consensus by which they all agree on this, and that proof of work puzzle is part of this. They're basically being, in the Bitcoin's case at least, rewarded with Bitcoin to do this. Now, this is the Bitcoin idea. It's since been shifted a little bit. Once Bitcoin came through and people realized that this was the first use case, in fact. Bitcoin, we think about it as a currency and that's it. Well, really what it was this is a currency that was the first use case of the blockchain technology that allowed us to have this money. So now we're having this very rich, expansive, ongoing conversation about just phenomenal number of different things that I'll go into in a moment, that what we can do with it. But it meant that people could think about things differently. One of the key things that it did was to establish the notion of a digital asset. There was no such thing as a digital asset until this came along. That might seem unfamiliar to you, but it's truly the case because we talked about the capacity to replicate things on the internet. If you could just replicate digital information, it can't be scarce. And an asset needs to have a scarcity component to it, right? So that's why when you have your iTunes account and you buy what you think is your own forever song, it's in fact a perpetual license with Apple to use this. And the way that Apple enforces it is through litigation, not through a sale of an asset. But Bitcoin's an asset because you can't replicate it. I can't double spend it. There is only one account of this thing. And that's a really big idea because we can start to think about how we can put other forms of value into a blockchain and share it around and digitally represent it, which is going to be very important for supply chains. Another thing that's come out of it is this notion of smart contracts, whereby because we are now, rather than just trusting one institution to keep track of the record, we have the capacity to trust this broad network of computers to verify the validity of a certain set of actions, then I actually don't like the term smart contracts that much because it's not really a contract. A contract exists outside between two parties. What we're really talking about with smart contracts is automated execution of the terms and conditions of a contract. But the cool thing is we can execute these terms and conditions and know both parties to the contract can trust that it's being done fairly because it's being validated by this network that nobody can take over. So this network, so both of us can say, I know that you can't manipulate it and you know that you can't manipulate it. So ultimately our contract will execute fairly and in an automated way. So it is yet another way for us to bring powerful automation that we couldn't do before. And again, very important for supply chains. Now, I've been focusing on Bitcoin. I think it's very, very important to come to understand the blockchain through the prism of Bitcoin. I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, but I would, which is a term you might hear, but I am of the belief that there's a principle behind Bitcoin that is critical, and this was just permissionlessness to it, right? So we talked about how Satoshi wanted to create an environment which there was no one in charge, and through this mechanism, he created that. What's happened since is people said, wow, all this stuff is cool, smart contracts and digital assets and everything else. But you know what? That sort of crazy permissionless thing is really difficult to deal with because it requires this native currency that's not the dollar, and what the hell is that? And do I really want to trust this arbiter of truth to be this amorphous mass of miners? The reality is Bitcoin works even though ISIS could be a miner. A miner, as you probably know, is one of the computers in that validating network. You could have ISIS functioning as a validator and proving a block. And you don't know it, but you can still trust it because the system won't let them. Now, you could argue that ISIS is one of the few entities that might be motivated to actually spend the billions of dollars to take the thing down because they don't have the same interest in protecting their value like the rest of us. But the principle is there. That's what we think about. Still, that's a really hard idea for a lawyer, a general counsel to come to. So yeah, we'll just trust the ISIS and Chinese miners and everybody else to prove what it is. And if that's the way our legal system frames responsibility as it does, it's hard. So with all of that in mind, people have said, well, let's just create a blockchain without Bitcoin. To which lots of Bitcoiners thought, that just scoffed, that's crazy, because all you're doing is going back to a pre-Bitcoin world. We've had distributed ledgers that were not permissionless. We've had permissioned distributed ledgers for quite some time. And they've had really smart consensus mechanisms within them to use. Things called PBFT, Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance. This is a mechanism by which a known group of parties can trust that each of you are agreeing to update the ledger in a certain way. It's actually a really powerful, cool idea. But nobody was doing it back in the 90s because it was too hard. So I actually think this is okay, even though the hardcore Bitcoiners think it's crazy to just build this thing that's old. What's interesting to me is Bitcoin made this happen. So now, those of you who are familiar with what's happening in the the supply chain, blockchain world will probably realize that it's happening around permission networks because it's so hard to get to permissions. And so I have a view that we should actually try to push society towards open architectures, free access to all, and permissionlessness is part of that. But I fully understand that the step is difficult. So anyway, a lot of the things that we're talking about now as we move forward, these various other use cases are being thought of in a generic way about what digital ledger technology, which is the term we're using to describe this full set of blockchain ideas, can do. Security settlement's a big one. Automatic tracking, we saw the clearinghouse model. Now if we have a distributed structure, the idea is that banks can now trade these digital assets, these digital representation of the securities and other things that they share across each other and update each other's ledgers immediately, which could save a phenomenal amount of money from the internal workings of the back offices of our financial system. Real-time auditing. Why do we actually need quarterly auditing or annual auditing, and therefore all of the infrastructure that goes with that? I'm sorry to the accountants in the room. If we know at any given time that the ledger is perfectly updated and reliable and we've all agreed upon it. We don't need this anymore, right? I mean, this is not going to happen tomorrow, of course, but this is the kind of future we need to start thinking about. Auditing, I actually think auditors are a little bit like lawyers. They'll find really clever ways to become useful. They'll start auditing the algorithms, which is fine. They should be doing that too. Property registries. I lived a lot of my life in the developing world. I was in Indonesia and Argentina, and I saw a lot of the harm that comes from these poorer communities who can't prove their assets. And one of the reasons they can't is they can't trust the government registrar to look after the data. They're either destroyed, there is incompetence, there's always incompetence everywhere, or there's corruption. You can just buy the guy out and he'll delete your property and put somebody else's name in there. The idea that we might be able to register these assets into something like a blockchain is a powerful idea. It gives people the capacity to take their assets that they own, they've always owned, and now turn into a mortgage or some other form of value, right? Artist rights management, we talked about the digital asset. Well, the idea, the artists, the digital photographer, for example, is the biggest victim of this whole replicability that the internet gives us. So can we take a representation of a photo or something like that, register this, and tie it to a smart contract within a blockchain so that now artists can actually charge for every single use they have of their photograph? There's a lot of work going into this space right now. One of the most important things is to think about what the blockchain can do, not just to fix the problems we have now, but how it might make possible the future that we are starting to build. And the Internet of Things is a classic example, which I would roll decentralized energy into that, trading mechanisms between microgrids and these things. How are you going to trust your neighbors or the guy down the street's smart meter that it's telling you the right information if you're going to trade power with them? How are we going to trust it? Well, we could put the public utility in the middle of every single decentralized microgrid, but that isn't going to work. Same with the Internet of Things. Are we going to trust Ford to be the owner of all the data that's being accumulated between self-driving cars? Is GM going to want that? Should the rest of us want GM and Ford to control that data? We need decentralized trust architectures to manage the decentralized economy that we are building. And I think the blockchain, whether it is this blockchain or some other version of it, this very concept of a decentralized version of trust management is going to be critical for IoT. A difficult one is identity. We rely on governments and other registries to keep track of our passports, birth certificates, these sorts of things. But people are talking about identity in this much more expansive idea now. A lot of work at MIT Media Lab around this. Digital identity is something that we accumulate through our activity, our lives online. And we have a whole set of different attributes and attestations to who we are that make up this complex notion of identity. And reputation is a big part of that. If we could figure a way to anchor all those ideas into a blockchain transaction, it could be a very powerful way for people to sort of really overcome some of the limitations. I will say it is one of the hardest nuts to crack, though, because identity is complex and actually dangerous. Again, Equifax. And of course, supply chains. So let's just have a look at why supply chains. We'll go with this one, but do I need a blockchain? Again, this is a really important question to ask a lot. And the answer is not always yes, obviously. There's this whole, one of my pet peeves is a blockchain is a noun, and it's a countable noun. It's a ledger. So I'm not really happy with blockchain as a non-countable noun, this idea that we're going to just embrace blockchain. It makes me uncomfortable. But I've recognized that language is a living thing. We have to deal with it. What I really don't like is blockchain as a verb. To blockchain something just drives me nuts. But you do get this idea, it's like, we could just blockchain this. Why don't we blockchain that, blockchain this? And of course it's like, well, hang on a second. Why don't we just use a database? A blockchain is not a database, by the way. It's just it's a log of records, of changes of state, of transactions. And the answer, if you're talking about it from a certain perspective, is often no. If all of us are in agreement that we could just share information amongst each other, use a SQL database or a distributed mechanism by which we will all agree on the update, maybe we're more than happy to have Walmart run inventory management system and just have them look after it, right? That's fine. But there's this really core question, and it gets back to this whole point about why we care about this stuff. What is trust? And ultimately, this is a difficult question to answer. If we think statically about the way things are, I have this supply chain, I have this set of members, we do this one thing, and we all have this one problem that we face with each other, then it might not be worth building a blockchain because it's a computationally heavy exercise. Everybody has to do computing on it. It's complicated. It requires a whole set of protocols and agreements and so forth. The trust problem that I have just might not be high enough to justify that cost. But I'm going to suggest that we don't really think enough about this, that this is a really fundamental problem. Because there's so many things that we can't do, and because we don't trust each other. There's so much reconciliation that we have to do with each other's accounts because we don't trust the data we're sending. We have an enormous amount of back office activity that is built around resolving this problem. We don't define it in those terms because we just see it as the thing we've always done. We've always had this reconciliation. We've always done this particular accounting process. And then there's all the things that you could never imagine doing. And I think that as we move into a 3D printing world, this IoT kind of structure, I don't think we're going to be able to sort of onboard and do all this sort of radical change unless we grapple with the problem of trust. But it's a real powerful idea. It really didn't come out looking too good when I blew that photo up, did it? Those are cows, in case you're wondering. Garrett Hardin's famous, Tragedy of the Commons essay from 1968 tells us that human beings can't agree how to look after a common resource when there are, incentives to be a first actor and to be a free rider. And so we've always had to look after the commons, which in this case was a reference to some grassland that the cows were eating, through outside regulation, because I'm just going to put my cows out there to eat more grass than yours because I can't trust that you wouldn't beat me to it. And this is like an expression of, in many respects, the core failing of humanity. As we try to form cooperative ventures and pursue common goals, we run up against this challenge, and so we have to figure out how to govern that challenge. And again, we get back to what we talked about before, institutionalized ledger keepers, governments and so forth. They've resolved this for us. But Bitcoin's genius was to sort of take us over that chasm to say, well, maybe now we can actually act in our own self-interest and in the interest of the whole. Because the public blockchain is a public good. This commonly recognized ledger is a commons. But there's no one regulating that outside. These actors are all acting in their self-interest to do so. So we take this idea and we apply it to supply chains. And I think it's really pretty powerful because supply chains embody this problem. You have this common venture. You all want Apple to sell more iPhones, but you also have a real reason for mistrust within that common venture. Each guy's, whoever is the supplier to the purchaser, wants to sell at a higher price than the other one. No one really wants to show off their inventory and so forth. These are inherent limitations on our capacity to arrive at this common goal, that is to sell more widgets. I think supply chains, and one of the reasons why it's become such an exciting field, is that people are realizing that this trust problem is absolutely core to the system. So that we're talking about now bringing the blockchain into this whole new vision, where it can be, you have this open infrastructure, if it's a permissionless system certainly. You have ways to cryptographically identify different players within it, which is a way to say, I know the identity of this particular actor. I can see and understand who you are, and I've got a way to prove that you are not somebody else, and therefore rely on your participation in this information sharing exercise. We can think of the assets and transactions that get transferred, whether they are the goods or the money itself, as having this regular updated registry, so we can keep track of things in a sequential, perfectly time-stamped way. The smart contracts are a powerful part of this. It really embraces the idea of automaticity. And then there's all sorts of other layers of functionality and a sort of a common area of trust. And then you get this sort of real-time visibility. The capacity to see, we talked about auditing being useless now because we can see all the time. The capacity to see everything at any given time and know at any given moment when things have moved is really, really powerful. And this comes down to the fact that we have the capacity to resolve trust in this. And I'll say capacity because this is a difficult technology. We are not there yet, I don't think, entirely. But we have the capacity to resolve the trust problem, which is the biggest barrier we face to all of the things. We have RFID chips, you have control towers, you have serialization coming, you have all these big ideas to figure out how to trace goods and prove efficiencies across supply chains. But the biggest problem you face is nobody can figure out how to share the information. So we may be able to solve this tragedy of the commons with this thing. But let's just look about one of the things that are beneficial in this. I hate to pick on Chipotle all the time, but they're just so easy in this case, right? But they took 16 months to just come up with the conclusion that the source of the E. coli that did enormous damage to their brand and therefore to their share price, and they have not recovered from it. This is 2 years ago. 16 months later, they said, we think it comes from Australia. I'm an Aussie. I know how many slaughterhouses, how many farms, how many cows there are in Australia. It's not very helpful, right? If you're trying to have real-time visibility on your suppliers and know where your problems are so that if a problem arises, you can actually stop it in real time, you need something far better than this messy, blind environment that Chipotle and others, they are just an unfortunate victim, because this could be anybody, right, that we face, right? Now, I get, you guys are about making dollars and cents, which is absolutely critical. I think it's also worth thinking about what is at stake in terms of humanity here. So Bridget McDermott from IBM pointed out to me that they were thinking about how do you monitor cement and the sort of provenance of cement. I had no idea that one of the reasons why certain countries have really earthquake-prone buildings and others not is because the quality of the cement can't be monitored, and different suppliers will not water down but dilute the quality by bringing in less other substances into the cement. And sure enough, just after I spoke to her, we had the earthquake in Mexico, and people were like, why? Why do these buildings fall? Now, it can be structural and there's other reasons for it. Building codes are all part of it, but faulty cement kills people. Bad cement is a function of the inability to trace where the resources are coming from down the supply chain. So there's some high value goals that we can attach to this. But ultimately it's about efficiency. Because if we were able to see with this level of transparency and visibility across this common purpose that we're calling our common supply chain, then we can start to really, through smart contracts and everything else, work hard at how much of each resource we're using at each phase of production. And that has profound implications for the planet as well, right? I think that, adding more renewable energy sources and is just one part of the solution that we will face, or that we should face as we reach towards solving climate change. A far bigger, well, at least equally large, is just how we actually use stuff, how much we use of it. And one can imagine a more efficient world where there is visibility around every participant in this process towards what this phrase of a circular economy, more recycling, more value. It's a very different economy. It's a very different value equation. But I think these are realities. Now, finance is a key aspect here, and I'm going to talk to you about two separate components of it. One is that the blockchain can be valuable for literally unlocking trade finance. As many of you probably know, I don't know if it's something like half the SMEs of the world can't get letters of credit because they can't prove that the bills of lading and the other documents that they provide to recognize the warehouse receipts and so forth haven't been double pledged to somebody else or doctored in some way. And banks just don't trust these documents. But now there's this idea to take a permanent record of these documents. And this is not actually such a supply chain management question as rather sort of a finance and document registry point. But nonetheless, it definitely feeds into supply chains. And therefore be able to actually issue credit in ways that we weren't able to before, which I think is a much more exciting thing for the world from banks to do than just figuring out how to move assets back and forth on Wall Street. But the other thing I think that's really important, and perhaps even more so, is how much we might actually bypass the need for finance because of the greater information that we can draw from the visibility of a blockchain-based system. So Foxconn, as you probably know, a massive producer of electronics with just thousands of tiny suppliers making capacitors and transistors and all sorts of tiny weeny things. Many of them with no access to finance because they operate out of little factories in the Pearl River Delta and so forth, is bringing a lot of them into its own supply chain, its own blockchain-based system, and saying, if you do so, I'm going to reduce the payment terms from 90 to 15 days or whatever it currently is. It's a reverse factoring model. And what it does is it sort of cuts out the bank. It turns Foxconn into a bank. So people often wonder, how are we going to monetize these systems? Where's the value in it? What is in it for these big players? I think it's this. I think it's the capacity to build dependencies and relationships and more tightly wind the interests of everybody together through things like these innovative, you can call them financial mechanisms. I would call them liquefying mechanisms. We're just liquidating the supply chain, speeding up the transaction process, and that's actually really good for society as a whole. So, yeah, it's kind of like being your own bank is what I would say. But the thing is, I really often believe that when we talk about what to do with this stuff, we need to think more expansively than we do. And I find the term supply chain itself a little problematic because it seems to, it doesn't have to, but it seems to imply to me a club, a set group. This is my supply chain. This is our supply chain. These are the members of that club. And it's kind of a closed way of thinking. But if we are moving towards this 3D printing, everything on much more fluid, dynamic global world, then we're going to have to start thinking about a much more fluid onboarding process. Obviously, one of the reasons why supply chains are fairly rigid, at least in certain sectors, is because the credentialing and the need to approve and prove the quality of each participant is so expensive and time-consuming that it creates a barrier, and a legitimate one, because you don't want to get Chipotle's problems. And yet they still have them, right? But if we can think about how IoT devices, for example, that can have their own log of history and record it in a blockchain so that we know that this is repeatedly, reliably being, working at a specific temperature and always repeatedly doing exactly what we want it to do in terms of the data, and all of this is there open for us, then maybe we have a much more fluid environment. We have a demand chain. And that's a scary idea, right? Because a lot of supply chains are all about protecting our vested interests. So who's going to make this step? Well, it might be the small guys who want to take on the big supply chains. But this is the world I think we're going to. And the reason why the blockchain is important to this is because we start to think about ventures as being not necessarily this linear sequential thing where there is the company at the top that's ordering the products to be produced, and there's a set of rules around doing that, but rather there's a responsiveness to the customer's needs, and then everybody comes together in a kind of a collective project. So we're talking about IP if it's 3D printing. We're saying, you and I, let's work together. This customer wants this type of shoe, and there's a bidding process, and each different supplier can submit their IP to this process. It starts to look a little bit like a movie, with the producer getting a cut and the director getting a cut. And rather than having the last guy at the end, we end up with a royalties type model. Again, this is not going to happen tomorrow, but I think that it's also folly to imagine that we live in this static world. And so whatever we're doing with our design for the blockchain needs to recognize that we are in a very fast-moving environment, regardless of the blockchain. Right? 3D printing, IoT, all these different standards that we're producing into this world. And so maybe we need, this is my pet point, permissionless systems. We need to think at least think hard about openness, because it's quite possible that what we end up doing with these very kind of closed permission structures, where every member of the supply chain agrees that they are going to validate the network through there with computers, that we create, once again, these siloed environments. And it's not very dynamic, and somebody comes along and is able to blockbuster you, right? Because they've got the far more fluid and dynamic chain than this closed world does. The internet won the battle for global interconnectivity, not the intranets, right? Minitel from France, have you heard about that one? Where'd it go, right? Because these open systems are so much more vibrant and dynamic and open. They will outcompete you. So it's very understandable that in this really difficult legal environment, this set of restrictions that we have around the way we behave, to leap to something as wild as a permissionless system. But it's also, I think, really important to imagine that kind of very dynamic, open future. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. So I'm lucky because I'm about to just talk about this stuff for the rest of my life, basically. I'm turned 50 the other day. So I think the blockchain is still got a long way to go before it actually gets to anywhere. So I've got some money to be made just continuing working on this. I don't want it to happen too fast, basically. But these are the sorts of challenges we face. And we at the Media Lab, the Digital Currency Initiative, are trying to figure out how to get there. But a key one to think about, garbage in, garbage out, right? So it's bad enough to put bad data into any database. Putting it into an immutable database that nobody can change is really bad, right? So we've got to be clear about the last mile problem. So Bitcoiners often talk about this trustlessness, which I find a terrible word, because I think the world revolves around trust. We need trust. We don't want to kill trust. But what we do, I think, is we move the perimeter of trust out. So we resolve this transactional record-keeping role without having to trust an entity. But we still have to trust the institutions and the devices and the human beings who are entering that data into it. So to make all this stuff work, we've got to come up with good standards for IoT devices. We've got to come up with good standards. We have to figure out what our processes were. Some of it starts with what we're doing anyway, but I think that it needs to, once you start to meld that to a blockchain, it becomes quite interesting as well, because there's a reinforcement capacity. Once we trust the ledger keeping process, it can be a kind of a referential thing back to the practices about what we do at that outer layer. Scalability. Right now, if we use permissionless chains, there are really not many transactions we can do per second. And when the whole world is running, if we were to use Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever to run that, it's just completely unviable, which is, again, one of the reasons why people are looking at permissioned ledgers. You can do a lot more because you're not bound by this complicated network of computers. But there's lots of really cool, interesting solutions to this problem. There's a thing called the Lightning Network, which is being developed in part by my colleague Taj Driger over at the Digital Currency Initiative, which shifts the transaction activity off the chain. So it's now really fluid. It doesn't have to be, not every transaction is being processed by this massive network of computers. Instead, it's fluidly happening in an off-chain environment, but then periodically it's proven to the blockchain. So you get this snapshot, this capacity, and we can all trust that these are all accurate because these periodic transactions are the case. And so these sorts of ideas are being thought about. How does the blockchain become an anchor? How does Bitcoin, for example, or Ethereum, another very important blockchain, become an anchor to these otherwise permissioned and more trust-dependent sort of environments? Legal barriers this is just outside of the box, right? I mean, where does the authority to decide what's a fact reside in a blockchain? Where does the buck stop? Right, these are really important questions. What is possession? When does good transfer from one player to another if the key point is the ownership and control of a cryptographic key? Should have said this earlier on, but I mean the cryptographic key, your private key, a secret key, is the means by which you have control over these digital assets. If I pair it with my public key, my public address, I then basically declare to the world that I have rightful control over this asset and I can now shift it to somebody else. So control of the asset in some respect comes down to control of the digital key. It makes cybersecurity all the more important, the question about like, how do we protect those keys? And then what are the legal responsibilities around all of that? Oh, I jumped over one. Transparency. This is one that always comes up amongst supply chain people. It's like, why would I want to have this open system? Because I don't want to show everybody my inventory. And that's a pretty legitimate thing to be concerned about. The first thing I would say is, for one, the blockchain is not a database. It is not a public record of everything. It is a set of hashes that capture changes of state. Now, there is a concern that we could maybe, using all sorts of data analytics, figure out what's going on by extracting powerful knowledge from that. And therefore, the transparency still is a legitimate concern, but there is some fabulous work being done around homomorphic encryption, which is another big word that you don't need to necessarily absorb, but it is around this idea of multi-party computing. Everybody gets to compute together on a set of data, and we don't know the details of that data, but we can learn really interesting and important things from every incremental change in the total amount of data, which is actually often all you need to know. Has this state changed? Because I saw this change, but not knowing what the details are. I really think this is going to be very important for the financial sector, where banks don't want to show what their positions are, but need to know which other's the collective ledger state is. And I think it's going to be really important for supply chains. And then whether it's done legally through governments or through, I would say, hopefully more readily, the industry itself, we've got to find standards. We've got to figure out what are we thinking about in terms of when does possession change? What is going to be the standard by which we accept a device to be the right device or not? How do we, there's this concept called KYM. You probably know KYC, know your customer, which banks insist upon. Well, there's this thing of know your machine. How do we sort of like establish these rules around what is the viable thing? And then there's just this core problem. I mean, everyone has to come together to agree on this, right? It's a herding the cats problem. And so, which brings us back to the tragedy of the commons. There is still this problem. We need to come together around these sorts of standards. But I would argue that supply chains are competing with each other. So one supply chain manages to get its act together, it creates a challenge for the others. I do think that this is not going to be as static as it might otherwise seem. This is my point earlier on, just to re-emphasize that. Permission, permissionless, these are core questions about the openness of the system. And I just re-emphasize the point that, if we just think about this present state with this static structure where everything is defined as one entity along the chain, we are going to lead ourselves to be at risk of this future state. So it's a 3D printed interior to a car. We're not there yet where this stuff is viable expense-wise, but we will get there. And when we move into that world, I think we have to think hard about what sort of management of information we come up with. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions if we have time for that. No, but
First of all, thank you.
Thank you.